So today I will continue with my discussion of Ashis Nandy's The Intimate Enemy, Loss and Recovery of Self Under Colonialism, published by Oxford University Press in 1983. Now, in my closing remarks on the book, a few days ago, I had been discussing the psychology of colonialism as Nandi describes it in this work. And in particular, towards the closing moments, I had looked at the whole question of Nandi's exploration of the nature of what we might call sexual dominance, or the particular manner in which the British sought to impose a certain order of sexuality in India. And it is Nandi's submission, which is particularly evident from his first essay. So this book is comprised of two essays. The first essay is called The Psychology of Colonialism, and the second one is called The Uncolonized Mind. So it is Nandi's submission, an argument that he really explores to the fore, brings to the fore in the first essay, although there are obviously shades of that in the second essay as well. The argument then is that, in fact, the kind of sexual dominance that the British sought to impose in India, its repercussions can be understood in the following manner: that in India, the idea was that androgyny is something that in many ways is superior both to masculinity and femininity. Now, I'm going to come back to this issue in a different way, because we're going to look at Nandi's exploration very briefly of what you might call the relationship of the part to the whole, and the particular manner in which the exclusive part can be seen in opposition to the inclusive whole. So the inclusive whole would be androgyny, the exclusive part would be masculinity, or on the other hand, femininity, because each excludes the other. And the whole idea of androgyny, of course, is the notion that men should be men, but should attempt to find the feminine within them. And similarly, that women should be women, but should attempt to find the masculine within them. Right? So this is what Nandi really means by the exclusive part versus the inclusive whole. But let me return to that, because there's a larger theoretical argument, and that's only one illustration of that kind of antonymy or opposite that Nandi is going to really talk about in this book. But the particular illustration that he gives to a greater extent than any other, because he explores it in greater length, and that's the illustration of the deployment of sexuality, if I may put it in this way, by Gandhi, right? And that one of the reasons, and I recall that this is the comment with which I, in fact, had actually concluded my discussion of the book a few days ago, was that if you look at the assassination of Gandhi by Nathuram Godse, one of the arguments that Godse advances at his defense is that he had to do away with that old man, as he put it, because this old man, this fakir, to use Churchill's expression, part of Churchill's expression, was a person who was not only effeminate, but whose presence in India would effeminize the entire nation. Right? And that's where I recall I had concluded my remarks. Now, to give a more full-fledged understanding of the book, albeit still a brief one, because I intend to keep this discussion to about 15 to 20 minutes, I want to look at something that Nandi says towards the conclusion of the book. On page 112 in the paperback edition, the first paperback edition. I think that the second edition might retain the same pagination, although there's a new preface, although I'm not certain of that. And so this is in section 6 of the last essay, just about 2 pages before the end of the book. And he says, I have examined under different rubrics 4 sets of polarities which have informed most discourses on the East and the West in colonial and post-colonial times. These polarities are the universal versus the parochial, the material or the realistic versus the spiritual or the unrealistic, the achieving or the performing versus the non-achieving or the non-performing, and the sane versus the insane. I have also touched upon a 5th set which cuts across these 4, a self-conscious, well-defined Indianness versus a fluid, open self-definition. Now we can look at each of these polarities, although I think it would be more interesting to really concentrate on just a few ideas. So when, for example, Nandy says that, look, I mean, the book is organized under these rubrics in a way, and one of these polarities is the universal versus the parochial. Well, one way to understand it is that all the universalisms of our times are claimed on behalf of the West. Right? So remember what Francis Fukuyama had so pompously argued 20, 25 years ago, the end of history. So this was after the fall of the Soviet Union. He wrote this essay, then turned this essay, which was barely worth publishing to begin with, in my judgment, but he turns it into an entire book, which becomes a bestseller. It tells you something about our times, of course, and how people really think. But what was the argument of the essay? That now that the Soviet Union had collapsed, it was very clear that all of humankind was destined to move according to the same teleology. And that apotheosis of human civilization was something that had been achieved in the West. The idea of the liberal human being living in a democratic society, partaking in the free market economy. That's so therefore the end of human destiny, if I may put it a little bit, with some cheekiness, is that all of us should frankly learn to be good consumers. Once we've become all good consumers, we have achieved fulfillment. Right? So, but that's a universalism. The idea of democracy, the idea of liberal democracy, the idea of the free market economy, right? All that comes out of India is parochialisms. That is, certain notions and ideas, according to what Nandy is saying, that this was the opposition that the British set up, that what comes out of colonized societies are, in fact, ideas that are particular to that society. But this is not the only sense in which Nandy is speaking about this polarity between the universal versus the parochial, but I'm giving only one more rudimentary way of understanding this polarity, right? The sane versus the insane, because of course, the colonized are people who are childish. Right? They're like children. They're like women, literally, from that point of view, because the whole idea was that it is the male of the species that embodies, particularly the male of the species in the West, that embodies ideas of rationality, right? And that's what he means by the polarity of the sane versus the insane. But again, this is a rudimentary way of looking at it, because to really have a full-fledged understanding of it, we would have to look at the nuances of many of the arguments that Nandy is really putting forward. But this is an attempt to explain to the reader what Nandy means by these polarities, and when he says that the book is organized under these rubrics, right? Or the polarity between the achieving or the performing versus the non-achieving or the non-performing. And one way to look at it is this idea that the notion of productivity is something that really the Orient, the non-West, is not fully attentive to. Let us recall that one of the great tropes that came out of Orientalist discourse was the myth of the lazy native, right? The lazy native. The native never really works. And of course, one of the implications of that was that, well, all of these territories really are territories that we are appropriating, are territories that Indians and Africans don't really know how to put to good use, right? Because they don't make the land productive enough. Right? This is in fact actually a variation of the doctrine of terra nullius. Terra nullius is literally, empty land, an argument that was used to appropriate places like Australia, that there's no one there, right? But in fact, this idea that India is a wasteland because under the natives it's not productive enough. This is in fact actually a variation, I would argue, of the doctrine of terra nullius. So on the one hand, he says this, right, that the book is organized under these rubrics, and each of these arguments is really, unravels in the book in all kinds of ways, with not simply sophistication and brilliant elegance, which characterizes all of Nandy's writings, but it's really breathtaking the kind of thinking that has gone, if I may say so, behind much of this work. Now, he also says, and this is on page 88, and this is where I go back to some of the remarks I made about 5 or 10 minutes ago. He also says that when we are thinking of these polarities, we also have to be mindful of the fact, okay? We have to be mindful of the fact that the true antonyms are in fact actually different, or opposites are in fact different from the popular antonyms, that these popular antonyms are not always the true opposites. So therefore, the masculine and the feminine are not really necessarily always the true opposites. Each of them is the exclusive part. So the true antonym is not masculinity versus femininity, but either of them against androgyny. That's the inclusive whole. The true antonym is not the past versus the present, right? Each of them exclusive of the other, but either of them versus the timeliness in which the present is the past and the present is the past and the past is the present, right? Not the oppressor versus the oppressed. I mean, think of modern day identity politics. It's all based on the notion that there is a very clear polarity between the oppressor and the oppressed. And Nandy's argument is that this is, in fact, not the true antonym. It is not the oppressor versus the oppressed, but both of them, either of them, versus the rationality, the instrumental rationality, which makes both of them into co-victims. And it's very important to understand that part, because victory is not simply catastrophic for those who have lost. It is, in the long run, actually more catastrophic for those who have won, very often, right? So this is what Nandy is saying, is that, you think about the ontology of the master and ontology of the slave. Right? And he says that actually, and this is in the preface, and I would say that, get a copy of the book, and if you're going to read nothing else, just read the preface, because each sentence is really brimming with ideas. Right? So he says, the essential reasoning is simple. Between the modern master and the non-modern slave, one must choose the slave, not because one should choose voluntary poverty or admit the superiority of suffering, not only because the slave is oppressed, not even because he works, which Marx said made him less alienated than the master. One must choose the slave also because he represents a higher order cognition, which perforce includes the master as a human. So for the slave, the master is always a human. Whereas the master's cognition has to exclude the slave except as a thing, or what some people would call objectification, right? And one way to understand this is in this beautiful dialogue with which I'll end. Well, dialogue is perhaps not the right word, an anecdote that describes something that Gandhi had written. So, one of Gandhi's, and again, interlocutor is perhaps not really the best word here, because it's not as if Gandhi and Du Bois really had a lengthy exchange of correspondence, although W.E.B. Du Bois, the greatest African American intellectual of his day, and now recognized as one of the 2 or 3 greatest African American intellectuals to have emerged in the last 125 years, right? But W.E.B. Du Bois first wrote about Gandhi in 1920s, and he retained an interest in him for 40 years until his passing. And he wrote 17 essays on Gandhi. Right? Now, Du Bois was the founding editor of The Crisis, practically the founding editor of this journal, a journal that was a vehicle of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples. And so the anecdote that I'm about to relate is an anecdote that dates back to about the late 1920s. I have recently published an article, I think it's just come out last week, from a journal in India called Social Change. And this is a long article which looks at Gandhi's relationship with African American intellectuals, and in particular with W.E.B. Du Bois and with the African American press. Now, so I've written about this particular anecdote at some length. So when Du Bois was editing this journal, and some years after he had become a huge admirer of Gandhi, he wrote a little note to Gandhi saying that, look, I would like to get a note from you, which I can publish in my journal as something of an inspiration for the readers. And this journal, the readership was comprised largely of Black people. It was comprised of African Americans. Remember, it's the vehicle, as I said, of opinion for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples. So Gandhi wrote back to him saying that I'm sending you a little love note, a little love note. It's a little missive that he's sending. And he says to Du Bois and to the 11 million African Americans, that was a population at that time, he says, none of you, even though I know that you come from a background of slavery, none of you have anything to feel ashamed about. It is really the slave owners who have something to feel ashamed about. Right? And this is really the argument that in loftier language, that in part that Nandi is putting forward here. Right? Namely, that the ontology of the slave is superior to the ontology of the master. And once one begins to understand this, one can understand how Nandi is therefore arriving at a reading of colonialism which is so radically different than what had been on offer for decades. And really, fundamentally, what is still on offer is a very conventional way of looking at colonialism. I think that this book will outlive almost every other book that we have on the phenomenon of colonialism in India. But he puts forward ideas which have implications for the present. So since I've talked about Gandhi a little bit in connection with Nandi's book, less so today than I did perhaps in my previous remarks on the book, Nandi says, and this is, I think, quite apropos of what I've been talking about. Nandi says that Indian society has held in trusteeship aspects of the West, which are lost to the West itself. Right? Now, what he means by that is really the idea, right, that there are certain things in Western culture which went by the wayside when the West went on this trajectory of modernity. Right? The West had to homogenize itself. It had to silence its own dissenters. It exiled some of them. It killed many of them. Right? Australia was a penal uh, colony, a convict colony. It's a place where England sent its prisoners, its criminals. Many of them were, in fact, not criminals at all. If you stole a chicken, you became a criminal. And in England, there were 200 offenses for which capital punishment was meted out in 1800. Right? But let's leave that aside. The point here simply is the West homogenizing itself, silencing its own dissenters, marginalizing the more radical, interesting thinkers within, right? What Nandy is saying is that if we think of the idea of freedom as something that is indivisible, that it's not possible for me to be free if there are others who are unfree. It's not possible for the West to be free if large parts of the world are unfree. Freedom is indivisible. And therefore, what he's also saying is that there are some elements within a culture which become recessive. They recede into the background. The best part of that, another culture brings it out. That culture holds that part of that culture in trusteeship, right? Trusteeship was an idea that Gandhi had. We have a very narrow reading of what that idea is. So I think you can understand all of that much better if you think about the fate of Gandhi in India today, because everywhere in India, Gandhi is under assault for all kinds of reasons. And we know that among the Hindu nationalists, there is even an attempt to glorify his assassin as the true bhakta, as a true shaheed, the true martyr of the nation. Right? And so, if we think now about Gandhi trusteeship and what Gandhi is saying, I would hazard the view that it is quite possible that when Gandhi is lost to India, that the West will perhaps hold Gandhi for India in trust until India is worthy enough to reclaim Gandhi. So next up, in a couple of days, I hope, is going to be my discussion of E.M. Forster's novel, A Passage to India. If you get a chance to take a look at it before, well and good. Bye-bye.